Iran. So basically, I will tell the Council that the time to act is now. It's today. Delay is not an option, and I hope to see some progress. Thank you.
Ambassador Xu Dezhi with China Central Television. Two questions. First, the UN has been criticized IDF's operation inside Syria to create buffer zone, the violation of disengagement agreement. Any response from you? And secondly, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu said that the IDF will stay there until another arrangement was made. In this case, has the Israeli government contacted with the caretaking government in Syria? What kind of arrangement do you want? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think that the UN should thank Israel. First, when UN positions were under attack, we reached our hands, we offered our support, and we protected the UN personnel in the first few days. We also offered to evacuate UN troops through Israel if there is a need to do that, and we are happy that it didn't happen at the end. And I think also not only the UN, but the international community should thank Israel for what we did in Syria. We neutralized the weapons of mass destruction that nobody wants them to be in the hands of terror groups. So I think the actions we took made the area a safer area, not only for Israel, but for the entire Middle East. We are not meddling in the internal issues in Syria. We are taking a very strong actions regarding our borders. We will not allow militants like Hezbollah to be next to the border on the Golan Heights. So now we are waiting to see what's happening with the new government to make sure that it's stable. And we have no intention to stay on those positions permanently. But we will not allow terrorists to take those positions.
But do you have communication now with the Syrian government?
I cannot answer that question. Thank you.
Yes, Pamela Falk, Ambassador from U.S. News and World Report. First of all, thank you. We look forward to hearing from a hostage family. And in terms of the deal in Qatar right now, there's different reports from Israeli press that say a deal is imminent or not. What are the outlines of a deal? Are the hostages released first? How does that? How do you see it?
Well, first, unlike the decision of the Security Council and the General Assembly, we made it very clear there will be a linkage between a ceasefire and the release of hostages. And that's what we are talking about now. I'm not sure it will be in one stage. We hope it will be in one stage because we want to see all the hostages back home. Maybe it will not be in one stage. And basically, it will be similar to what we saw in the past, more than a year ago, that you have a ceasefire, a long one, and at the same time of the ceasefire, during that ceasefire, hostages will be released. And we are talking mainly on the humanitarian aspect of women and sick and older hostages.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador Michelle Nichols from Reuters. You referenced maybe some news on that front by Christmas and Hanukkah next week. How confident are you that a deal can be reached by next Wednesday?
Well, unfortunately, because of the experience we have with Hamas, I cannot be confident. Because in the past, we had negotiations, we thought we have agreements, and they came up with new demands, with new names of prisoners that they want to release. So, it's not that you're negotiating with a state actor that you can negotiate and you can expect a result in a timeline. It's still a terrorist organization. I want to thank those mediators who are doing a lot trying to make it happen, but there is no guarantees.
And what security access guarantees does Israel want in Gaza as part of this deal?
Well, the security, we will take care of the security. Basically, it will mean that there will be a ceasefire, so we will have to hold our weapons for a while. But we are not counting on anyone. We are counting only on ourselves after October 7th. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The 9,819th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Khaled Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Shira Efron, Director of Research at Israel's Policy Forum, and Mr. Michael Levy, brother of Or Levy, who has been held hostage by Hamas. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Chiari.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, since the submission of the Secretary General's written report on Security Council Resolution 2334, hostilities and violence have continued throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. In the Gaza Strip, hostilities between Israel Defense Forces and Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups, including heavily Israeli bombardments through the Strip, have resulted in heavy casualties. In the occupied West Bank, high levels of violence persist amid ongoing Israeli operations, exchanges with armed Palestinians, settler-related violence, and Palestinian attacks against Israel. Among other deadly strikes in Gaza from 14 to 15 December, at least 69 Palestinians, including women and children, were reportedly killed in 4 Israeli strikes on schools sheltering IDPs in Gaza City, Beit Hanun, and Khan Yunis, including 20 killed in an airstrike hitting an UNRWA school in Al-Mawazi, Khan Yunis. The Israel Defense Forces say they were targeting Hamas militants. More than 250 Palestinians have been killed in such strikes in Gaza over the past week, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. The death toll of this war continues to mount. Since October 7, 2023, more than 45,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, according to the Ministry of Health, and over 1,700 Israeli and foreign nationals have been killed in attacks in or originating from Gaza, according to Israeli sources. In the occupied West Bank, on 12 December, an Israeli boy was killed in a shooting attack on a bus near the A1 Qadr junction in the occupied West Bank, south of Jerusalem. Israeli authorities say that the Palestinian perpetrators later turned himself in. The same day, Israeli forces reportedly killed a Palestinian man in an exchange of fire in Balata refugee camp near Nablus. Serious clashes have also taken place between Palestinian armed groups in the occupied West Bank and Palestinian security forces since the written report, particularly in Jenin camp following a Palestinian arrest operation and the seizure of Palestinian Authority vehicles by militants. Over several days, Palestinian security forces have killed an unarmed 19-year-old and detained numerous Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad militants, while the clashes have caused significant damage to the camp. Madam President, I will now highlight some of the Secretary General's observations regarding the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. I once again strongly condemn the horrific attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023 and the continued holding of more than 100 hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify these acts of terror. All remaining hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. I remain appalled that there are reasonable grounds to believe that hostages may be subject to ongoing sexual violence and abuse. While in captivity, hostages must be treated humanly and allowed to receive visits and assistance from the Red Cross. I reiterate that there is no justification for the deliberate killing, maiming, torture, and abduction of civilians and other protected persons, nor using sexual violence against them. The use of human shields and the firing of indiscriminate rockets toward Israeli population centers are violations of international humanitarian law and must cease. Turning to the situation in Gaza, a ceasefire is long overdue. The continued collective punishment of the Palestinian people is unjustifiable. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the larger number of civilian casualties, the blanket destruction of Palestinian neighborhoods, and the worsening humanitarian situation are horrific. The widespread devastation and deprivation resulting from Israel's military operations in North Gaza, especially around Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, are making the conditions of life untenable for the Palestinian population there. I condemn Israel's use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in densely populated area that has caused massive casualties and damage to residential buildings, schools, hospitals, mosques, and UN premises. United Nations premises are inviolable in all times. I reiterate my unequivocal condemnation of the widespread killing and injury of civilians in Gaza, including women and children, and the deprivation of essentials to survive. I'm concerned over what may amount to violations of international humanitarian law in the conduct of hostilities, including non-compliance with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attacks and against the effect of attacks. The international humanitarian law always applies to all parties to a conflict, and its application does not depend on reciprocity. The protection of civilians is paramount. There must be full accountability for any atrocity crimes that have been committed. I mourn the United Nations personnel killed in Gaza and strongly condemn the killing of all health and humanitarian personnel and journalists. I also condemn the looting of aid in the context of a breakdown of law and order. These are unacceptable and must stop immediately. I reiterate my call for the full investigation of all such incidents and accountability for any violation of international law. Due to continued restrictions imposed by Israel, looting by armed Palestinians, and overall insecurity, supplies have entered Gaza at levels that are inadequate to meet the overwhelming needs of the population, including large numbers of IDPs living in extremely overcrowded conditions. To address the needs, the United Nations and its partners urgently require the predictable entry and unimpeded movement of food, shelter materials, medicine and fuel, and the capacity to repair essential life-saving infrastructure, including the healthcare system. Noting its opening of additional entry points for humanitarian aid, I call upon Israel to fulfill its obligation as occupying power under international law, including allowing and facilitating rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need into and throughout Gaza, and to create the conditions that will permit the return of Palestinians to their homes. I know the relative success of the polio vaccination campaign. While falling short of our targets in the north of Gaza, the use of tactical pauses and examples of functioning coordination with Israel demonstrated what is possible and achievable. I reiterate my call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in Gaza. The United Nations is continuously engaged with all stakeholders toward these objectives and stands ready to support the implementation of an agreement. I welcome the continued efforts, including by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to overcome the significant obstacles and reach a deal. I remain deeply alarmed by the relentless Israeli settlement expansion in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that is fueling tensions, impeding access by Palestinians to their land, and threatening the viability of a future independent, democratic, contiguous, and sovereign Palestinian state. I reiterate that all Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity and are in flagrant violation of international law and United Nations resolutions. I'm deeply concerned that over the past year, the government of Israel has continued to systematically promote policies that have strengthened the involvement of civilian officials in control over the occupied West Bank, including transferring some security functions to civilian control, while some government officials called for the annexation of areas in the occupied West Bank. I urge the government of Israel to cease all settlement activities immediately. I note in this regard the recent findings by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, which declared inter alia that Israel's continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must end as rapidly as possible. The demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures, including internationally funded humanitarian projects, as well as structures related to income generation and the provision of essential services, entail numerous violations of international law and raise concerns about the risk of forcible transfer. I once again call upon the government of Israel to end this practice and to prevent the displacement of Palestinians in accordance with its international obligations under international law, and to approve plans to allow Palestinians to build legally and address their development needs. The escalating violence and tensions in the occupied West Bank are highly concerning and could trigger broader explosion. Intensified operations by Israeli forces, increased settler violence and attacks against Israeli have also exacerbated tensions and led to exceedingly high levels of casualties, detentions, and destruction. I'm alarmed by the lethal attacks carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, including sometimes in proximity and with the support of Israeli security forces, and by Palestinians against Israelis. All perpetrators of attacks must be held accountable. I reiterate that Israeli security forces in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must exercise maximum restraint and use lethal forces only when it is strictly unavoidable to protect life. I call on Israel to abide by its obligations under international law and to ensure thorough, independent, and prompt investigation into all instances of possible excessive use of force, holding those responsible to account. I'm particularly appalled that children continue to be victims of violence on all sides. I'm also concerned that Palestinian children continue to be arrested in large numbers and held for prolonged periods of time, including in administrative detention. I reiterate my call for Israel to use detention as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period to prevent all forms of ill treatment in detention and to end the administrative detention of children who are entitled to special protections. I'm disturbed at the numerous instances during the reporting period in which officials glorified violence and engaged in dangerous provocations, incitement, and inflammatory language, which will only lead to greater polarization and risks further bloodshed. Leaders have an obligation to clearly and explicitly condemn acts of terror and violence directed against civilians. The incitement to violence must stop immediately. I reiterate my call to the parties for the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem to be respected and upheld, taking into account the special and historic role Kingdom of Jordan as custodian of the holy site in Jerusalem. I'm deeply concerned with the adoption of the Knesset of Israel of two laws concerning UNRWA. These laws, if implemented, could prevent UNRWA from continuing its essential work in the occupied Palestinian territory, which would have devastating consequences for Palestine refugees, considering that there is no viable alternative to UNRWA which could adequately meet the needs. I again urge Israel to act consistently with its obligation under the Charter of the United Nations and its other obligations under international law, including under international humanitarian law and those concerning privileges and immunities of the United Nations. National legislation cannot alter those obligations. Madam President, it is vital that the international community provide immediate support to the Palestinian government to to address its fiscal challenges, strengthen its governance capacity, and prepare it to reassume its responsibilities in Gaza. We must establish political and security frameworks that can address the humanitarian catastrophe, start early recovery, rebuild Gaza, and lay the groundwork for a political process to end the occupation and establish a viable two-state solution as soon as possible. It is vital that these frameworks facilitate a legitimate Palestinian government that can reunify Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, politically, economically, and administratively, while reversing the steadily deteriorating dynamics throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. Any attempt to establish settlements in Gaza must be firmly rejected. There must be no attempt to reduce or annex the territory of Gaza in whole or in part. The devastations and misery of the past year have reinforced once again a simple truth. Palestinians and Israelis can no longer wait to establish a viable political horizon. Now is the time to lay the foundations for a better future for Palestinian, Israeli, and the broader region. Israeli, Palestinian, the states of the region, and the broader international community must urgently take steps that will enable the parties to re-engage on the long-delayed political path to achieve two-state solution. The United Nations remains committed to supporting Palestinian and Israelis in ending the occupation and resolving the conflict in line with international law, relevant United Nations resolution, and bilateral agreements in pursuit of the vision of two-state, Israel and independent, democratic, contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders on the basis of the pre-1967 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Chiari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Shira Efron.
Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the Security Council for the invitation to brief the Council today. It is truly an honor. Especially at the United Nations, the birthplace of the plan to partition mandated Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, it is pertinent to acknowledge that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a tragedy today for both Jews and Arabs. At the same time, it is also crucial to recognize, as the General Assembly did back then, that practical solutions exist and should be pursued. As an Israeli Jew, I speak from my lived reality. The trauma in Israel is palpable, with society still frozen in the horror of October 7, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. On that day, Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists murdered over 1,200 Israelis and nationals of other countries, abducted 251, and committed atrocities, including large-scale sexual violence. Today, 439 days later, 100 people, including soon-to-be a 2-year-old toddler and an 86-year-old grandfather, remain in captivity in Gaza, while their families, as you'll hear in just a few minutes, endure daily torment. We are all praying for their immediate release. Border communities bear the scars of destruction and displacement. Israelis continue to face insecurity with ongoing bombardments from multiple fronts and terror attacks on our streets. In Gaza, devastation is unimaginable. Countless lives lost, families shattered, including of my dear friends Khalil and Ahmed. Homes reduced to rubble, and populations struggling for survival with scarce basic necessities like food, water, and healthcare. The West Bank, meanwhile, is gripped by rising violence and economic hardship. For both societies, the wounds of this war are deep and will take years to heal. Yet, even now, steps can be taken to halt the suffering and begin charting a path towards stability and hope for both Israelis and Palestinians. Madam President, the collective challenge before us as Israelis, Palestinians, countries of the Middle East, and the international community is to seize this moment of profound tragedy and turn it into a bold diplomatic process that leads to peace, security, and prosperity for people across the region. While international actors frequently invoke the language of a two-state solution with goodwill and intent, reliance on mere sloganeering and rhetoric has done little to build trust or address the structural dynamics of the conflict. And while we at Israel Policy Forum also view the two-state option as the only viable framework that acknowledges the legitimate national aspirations of both sides, and is the only way to guarantee the future that Israel's founders envisioned, a Jewish, democratic, and secure state of Israel, we realize that two-state reality will remain only a vision unless we change our approach. What is needed now is a coherent, inclusive, and actionable strategy that moves beyond rigid thinking so that we can end the war, stabilize Gaza, and shift trends in the West Bank from creeping annexation to peaceful separation. Regional actors should leverage the potential for normalization with Israel to empower pragmatic actors while countering spoilers. This moment demands a shift from platitudes to planning, with a coordinated roadmap that addresses security and governance, delivers tangible short-term wins, and lays the foundation for our shared long-term vision. Nowhere is that more apparent than in the discussions about the day after in Gaza. Madam President, as we anxiously hold our breath for a hostage and ceasefire agreement, there is still no shared coherent plan for post-war Gaza. The international community sees basically one viable path out of this morass: establishing a transitional non-Hamas Palestinian administration in Gaza with the aim of eventually restoring full Palestinian PA governance once it is reformed and strengthened. Clearly, without a green light from the PA, regional and other international partners will not commit to Gaza's recovery. Yet, mostly for political reasons, whether we like it or not, the Israeli government has until now vetoed PA involvement, exacerbating the risk of either full Israeli occupation of Gaza or a Hamas resurgence, or both. Notably, this forum, it's important to acknowledge that despite extreme voices, most Israelis do not want to control the Palestinians in perpetuity, but they're scared and see no plausible alternative. To soften Israeli resistance, there is a need for a gradual, benchmark-driven approach with assurances that capitalizes on success stories, even if those are small. Existing PA capacity in Gaza can and should be mobilized for the humanitarian effort, for example, through relying on former security personnel and senior representatives in key government positions, including in the monetary and water authorities, with whom Israel already interacts today. Involving the PA and ensuring it has the capacities to succeed would also help alleviate fiscal and economic pressures in the West Bank, which is a deep concern for the Israeli security establishment. It would also incentivize sustained, more strategic donor engagement and enlist regional Middle East partners in restoring public order in Gaza's chaos. Further, consent for a meaningful PA role in Gaza should be explicitly leveraged to propel genuine PA reforms with clear objectives, a defined roadmap, and key performance indicators. The PA should demonstrate that it can really be part of the solution by reforming the so-called prisoner and martyr payment systems, creating a conducive environment for the private sector, strengthening judicial independence, reorganizing the security sector, addressing incitement, undertaking educational reform, and working toward a credible election horizon that allows for political participation of next-gen leadership. Without these reforms, realistically, Israel will continue to withhold tax revenues from the PA. US restrictions on aid will remain, and regional states will be hesitant to invest in the Palestinian economy and infrastructure, which will further deepen the PA's fiscal crisis and legitimacy crisis, and jeopardize stability both in the West Bank and Gaza. For its own long-term interest and to enable the PA to succeed, Israel must also take critical steps to shift its policy in Gaza and in the West Bank. These include easing financial pressures on the PA, allowing it to the operational space to effectively govern and secure the territory under its jurisdiction, to free settlement expansions in areas that undermine territorial separation, and in those only, and taking decisive action to stop settler violence. US leadership, security guarantees, and Arab-Israeli normalization can and should play a key role in driving these measures forward. There are no quick fixes to these long-standing issues, unfortunately, and the situation on the ground cannot wait for all our clocks to synchronize. Yet Israel and the international community should identify and amplify positive signals, such as Israel's decision to extend the indemnification for correspondent banking between Israel and the West Bank, as well as the current efforts by the Palestinian security forces to regain control of the refugee camp in the town of Jenin. Importantly, this initiative, alongside ongoing security cooperation and coordination between Israel and the Palestinians, even in the past 15 months, is the result of a long-term strategic international investment in the U.S. Security Coordinator, or the USSC. Building on such success stories is essential to both strengthen and improve the PA's capacity, while simultaneously alleviating Israel's legitimate security concerns. Madam President, so much depends on Israelis, Palestinians, the support of member states, and especially US leadership. But the UN, as an institution, has an integral role to play as well. Effective UN capacity is necessary for the humanitarian response, for recovery and reconstruction, for stabilization, and for assisting the Palestinian state in the making, in deed and not only in word. Internally, this requires tight coordination across UN agencies and between principals, streamlined funding, operational mechanisms, and strategic flexibility to step back from overly rigid approaches when pragmatism is needed. At the same time, the UN and Israel must repair their fractured relationship, which has reached unprecedented low. Both sides have legitimate grievances, but there is too much at stake to allow them to get in the way of efficient and forward-looking cooperation that is in both sides' interests. I will speak about the Israeli perspective. There is a long-standing sense of UN bias, compounded by what Israel sees as insufficient reaction to October 7 and its aftermath, and the evidence of UNRWA staff ties to Hamas. This trust deficit has real policy shortcomings of losing all support and leverage with Israel. Israelis need to hear an unequivocal UN condemnation of Hamas and its actions. And like the Palestinians, Israelis also need an international reaffirmation of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in a state of their own, and acknowledgement of the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Neither side will be partners in a political process that we both need if that process denies the legitimacy of these rights. To conclude, just as it did when it passed the partition plan in 1947, the UN has an important role to play in helping Israelis and Palestinians move beyond what has been the darkest period in their shared history. This can happen by zooming in on what is possible and achievable rather than what is perfect, and focusing on the solutions rather than getting stuck on the problems. Thank you, Madam President and members of the Security Council.
I thank Ms. Efren for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Michael Levy.
Thank you, Madam President, and distinguished members of the UN Security Council. Today, I stand before you not just as Michael Levy, but as a brother, a son, a human being, and as someone whose life has been shattered by unimaginable loss and despair. My brother, Or Levy, is one of the 100 innocent hostages currently held by Hamas in Gaza. For 439 days, Or has been missing from our family. 439 days of fear, anguish, and an unbearable silence that echoes louder than any words ever could. On October 7th, Or and his wife Einaf went to a music festival, seeking for a brief moment of joy. They arrived just 9 minutes before all hell broke loose. Missiles flew over their heads, and they had to run into a nearby shelter, thinking they will be safe. From that shelter, Or called my mother, repeating the terrifying words, "Mom, you don't want to know what's going on here." That was the last time we heard his voice. 10 minutes later, Hamas terrorists stormed the shelter. They threw grenades, sprayed bullets, murdered Einaf, and kidnapped Or into the tunnels of Gaza. The last image we have of him is heartbreaking, covered in his wife's blood, shocked and terrified. Or is more than just a number. He is a real human being, a father to an amazing 3-year-old son named Almog, who lost his mother in the horrendous terror attack of October 7th, and is now essentially orphaned. This baby had to celebrate his third birthday without his parents. Try to imagine your own child celebrating his birthday without you, going through life's milestones without you. Imagine not knowing if your child is okay and who is taking care of him. Almog keeps asking about mom and dad, and even when we try to explain, he doesn't understand why he can't see his dad and what it means when we say that mom will never come back. This baby still has a father who can come back to him. Do not let him become an orphan. You have the power to save his father. For 439 days, I've woken up every morning with a pit in my stomach, wondering where my brother is, wondering if he's cold, if he's hungry, if he managed to survive another day. Every moment he remains in captivity is a moment of unbearable suffering for him and for all of us who love him. I'm here today to remind this council and the world of its duty, not just as diplomats, but as people, as mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends, because this is not merely a political issue. This is a human issue, a moral issue. I want to ask every member of this council, what would you do if it was your child, your brother, your loved one? Hamas's actions are not just blatant violation of international law. They are an assault on humanity itself. Holding civilians hostage, men, women, children, is a violation of the principles that this very council was created to protect. And yet, your silence is deafening. Your inaction is suffocating. For every day this council fails to act, the message to the world is clear, that some lives are worth saving and others are not. But I refuse to accept that message. I refuse to accept a world where my brother's life can be used as a bargaining chip and be forgotten. I refuse to believe that this council, which was created to uphold the highest ideals of humanity, will turn its back on those who need it the most. This is your moment to act, to lead, to show the world that this council has the courage to stand for what is right and send a resonating message that terror will never prevail. I'm asking you to prove that international law means something, that human rights are not just words, but principles you will fight to protect. Demand the release of all, demand the release of them all. These 100 lives are not just numbers. They are fathers, mothers, daughters, sons, brothers and sisters. They are people with families waiting desperately to hold them again. I want to express my deepest gratitude to the American nation and all the rest of the nation that supported our campaign for standing with us in this dark hour. Your unwavering belief in freedom and justice is a beacon of hope for families like mine who are desperate for a lifeline. And to President Trump and Biden, we place our deepest hopes and faith that you will bring this tragedy to an end. Your decisive leadership has already brought light into a situation that feels so hopeless. We believe in your strength, your leadership, and your commitment to justice to help bring our loved ones back home. I want to finish with a personal note. Today is my birthday, the second birthday I mentioned without my baby brother. I'm not asking for any presents, celebrations, or even a cake. My only birthday wish is sitting in a Hamas tunnel waiting to be brought back to his son. Bring my brother home. Bring them all home. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Levy for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me thank Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari for his important briefing on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, and Dr. Shira Efron of the Israel Policy Forum, and Mr. Michael Levy for their perspectives on the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. We acknowledge the Secretary General's report and regret that this reporting period is marked by continued hostilities between Israel and Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in the Gaza Strip. This contravenes the provisions of Resolution 2334 that calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror as well as acts of destruction. As reported by OCHA, an estimated 26,000 of the wounded civilians in the Gaza Strip have suffered injuries that could lead to lifetime deformity and disability, especially among children. We note with concern the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world has been recorded in the Gaza Strip. In the same vein, we also recall that Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups have continued to hold the remaining hostages since 7th October 2023 without granting the necessary access or providing updates on their well-being. In Resolution 2334, Israel, the occupying power, is reminded of its legal obligations and responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949 relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war. However, the past 14 months in the Gaza Strip have presented compelling evidence that does not align with the provisions of the resolution. This is reflected in the current estimated death toll in the range of over 45,000 and the wounded at 106,000, with 70% of such casualties being women and children. The civilian population has been trapped in a deep humanitarian crisis at a scale and magnitude far beyond human comprehension. These statistics question our conscience and collective responsibility to advance durable peace and to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war as stipulated in the United Nations Charter. As families and communities are displaced due to the widespread destruction of their homes and critical infrastructure, the already vulnerable population in the north and elsewhere in Gaza are exposed to extreme weather conditions during this winter. What the Palestinians are currently experiencing represents a disruption of their livelihoods, social networks, and overall well-being. The alarming rate of violence in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in the context of Israel operations, armed exchanges between Palestinians, including armed groups, Israeli security forces, and settlers, often leading to restrictions, forced displacement, and demolition, contravenes resolutions of this Council and the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion of 19 July 2024. All of these actions on the ground seem to be counterproductive to the search for lasting peace in the Middle East. We are encouraged, however, by the increased political momentum in support of addressing some of the critical issues surrounding the Middle East peace process and the implementation of Resolution 2334. With that in mind, Sierra Leone welcomes the observations as highlighted in the Secretary General's report and would like to reiterate the following. First, we condemn the continuous killing and injury of civilians and the never-ending cycle of violence. to end this situation with demand for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, respect for international humanitarian law, and implementation of Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, including the most recent General Assembly resolution ES 10/33. We also call for the unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas. We further reiterate our support for UNRWA and its pivotal role in supporting the Palestinians. We express concern that any action to undermine its operations will be detrimental for Palestinian refugees in particular, not only in Gaza, but across other areas of operations. We welcome the various initiatives by the international community, including diplomatic efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, as well as the launch of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. Sierra Leone recalls the ICJ advisory opinion of 19th July 2024 and calls on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as they present an obstacle to peace and threaten the physical viability and delivery of a two-state solution. We further caution against any action that may threaten the economic, political, and administrative status of Palestine. We reject the escalation of violence in the occupied West Bank and call on Israelis and Palestinians to desist from all acts of incitement, inflammatory language, and provocations that may fuel tensions. In closing, Madam President, we urge the parties to recommit to a constructive dialogue embedded in the principle of the two-state solution while addressing the legitimate aspirations and concerns of both sides. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I begin by thanking ASG Khari, Ms. Efran, and Mr. Levy for their briefings. Today, we meet to discuss the latest SG report on Security Council Resolution 2334. This resolution underscores that Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory are in violation of international law and represent a significant obstacle to peace and the two-state solution. This position was further supported by the ICJ advisory opinion of 19 July, which called for the cessation of such activities. The international community's position is evident. On 18 September, the General Assembly adopted, with broad support, a resolution urging Israel to bring to an end its presence in the occupied Palestinian territory without delay. Despite these clear calls and legal obligations, Israel remains present within the occupied Palestinian territory. This constitutes a clear obstacle to justice for the Palestinian people. We have not failed to note during these 2 years statements and actions that appear to have as an objective the potential annexation of significant areas of the West Bank. These include measures to construct new illegal settlements, efforts to use the legal system to legitimize illegal outposts, and programs transferring administrative powers relating to land and settlements from military to Israeli civilian control. These measures are inconsistent with international law and hinder ongoing efforts to achieve lasting peace. President, at the same time, the unacceptable situation in Gaza is exacerbated by the obstruction of humanitarian aid and disruptions in aid delivery, as well as the breakdown of security. The northern Gaza Strip remains under effective siege. As we come to the end of our term on the Council, we will continue to articulate our clear stance on this crisis. We need an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire across Gaza and the broader region. It is equally crucial that this be accompanied with unhindered and sustained humanitarian access to deliver aid at the scale required to address the population's critical needs. We also reiterate our condemnation of the horrific 7th October attacks and maintain our calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Similarly, concerning is the rapid and steady degradation of the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We are deeply concerned about continued settlement expansion, settler violence, and the disposition and transfer of Palestinian communities. Recent escalations have seen a significant rise in demolitions and evictions, particularly targeting Palestinian homes and infrastructure. Additionally, settler attacks on Palestinian civilians, often carried out with impunity, have intensified, with reports of coordinated incidents in vulnerable communities. Such violence is compounded by restrictive measures on Palestinian movement, severely impacting access to basic services, education, and livelihoods. Illegal settlements, settler violence, and the presence of settlers itself remain among the root causes of most human rights violations in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. On top of being subjected to violent raids, women also face extremely limited access to maternal and reproductive health care, compounded by mental health challenges. These actions risk entrenching the occupation and further diminishing the prospects for a two-state solution. We call on Israel to reverse these measures and to uphold its commitments under international law. Inflammatory rhetoric on the future of the West Bank and the status quo of the holy sites must be avoided. The international community has a responsibility to promote accountability for violations of international law and to advance measures that foster peace and justice in the region. This requires addressing the root causes of the conflict and supporting mechanisms that ensure accountability. In conclusion, President, the international community must unite behind an irreversible realization of the two-state solution in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This must put an end to the illegal occupation and ensure that Palestinian aspirations for statehood and Israel's security concerns are equally fulfilled. Hand in hand with this, the international community's support to revitalize an economically sustainable Palestinian Authority as the sole representative of the Palestinian people must increase. The Authority's commitment, not only for reform, but also for keeping stability in the West Bank, particularly in refugee camps, should be sustained. This is the only way to bring a lasting end to unprecedented suffering and just peace to the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank ASG Carey, Dr. Afran for their briefings, and particularly Ms. Levy for his touching testimonies. Madam President, for more than 14 months, the region has been passing through its darkest moment, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and beyond. The vicious cycle of a spillover has been engulfing the entire region with endless violence and instability. Now we are witnessing with both hope and concern some positive regional developments, including the recent ceasefire across the blue line and the political transition in Syria. However, the situation in the occupied Palestine territory is not showing any sign of change. The Republic of Korea remains committed to its principle to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, along with the release of all hostages. Only this can save innocent lives, ensure humanitarian aid delivery, and create conditions for the reconstruction of completely flattened Gaza. Thus, we appreciate the never-ending efforts by the mediators and sincerely hope that the recently resumed negotiation can soon lead to a valuable outcome that stop the horror. Yet, we must be clear that ceasefire in Gaza will not be an end, but should serve as a true starting point for a better future for both Palestinians and Israelis. However, it is deeply concerning that over recent years, the world has been witnessing a negative trend that is hampering the vision of the two-state solution. As mentioned in the SG report, Israel has advanced, approved, or tendered for the last 2 years more than 38,000 housing units of settlements in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These settlements will add tens of thousands of Israeli settlers in this area. Resolution 2334 affirms that the establishment of settlement has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law. Israeli settlements are also in violation of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which provides that the occupying power shall not deport or transfer its own civilian population into the occupied territory. Also alarming is that Israeli settlements, coupled with impunity, are laying the groundwork for settler-related violence toward Palestinian civilians. We are deeply troubled by the ongoing settler violence, including the September attack against a Palestinian primary school near Jericho, as well as numerous instances targeting the olive harvest, a key source of income for Palestinians. Israeli settlements activities, coupled with persistent confiscation of Palestinian lands, are also displacing Palestinians from their land. It is alarming that Israel's routine demolition of Palestinian homes is accelerating this displacement. Settlement-induced fragmentation of the occupied Palestinian territory is also obstructing free movement of Palestinians, another violation of fundamental human rights. And checkpoints, closures, and curfews compound these daily indignities. The most troubling aspect is that Israeli settlement activities serve as a major obstacle to the achievement of a negotiated two-state solution, slicing the territories controlled by the Palestinian Authority into numerous non-contiguous pieces of land. The Republic of Korea firmly believes that this solution is the only viable path toward a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. The status quo one-state reality cannot be a substitute for this long-lasting aspiration. We once again stress our call that Israel should cease all settlement activities. To contribute to international efforts to reinvigorate the two-state solution, the Republic of Korea participated in the 2 rounds of meetings of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution. As reiterated during those meetings, the Republic of Korea will maintain its support for all relevant efforts, including its steadfast support for UNRWA, and reform the Palestinian Authority. We hope that Israel act more reasonably in reciprocating the call of the international community and supporting the work of UN agencies. Madam President, heading toward the end of the year holiday season, we wish for 2025 that brings a better future based on peace and coexistence, not only in Israel and Palestine, but also in the wider region. We hope that the ceasefire in Lebanon, albeit fragile, will be the beginning of the end to the widespread violation in the region. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. We commend the United States presidency for convening this session, addressing the ongoing situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and the Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs for her comprehensive briefing on the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2334. We are also thankful to the civil society briefers for the information provided on the matter. Madam President, Mozambique is deeply concerned by the persistent violations of Security Council Resolution 2334, the continued demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures in the occupied West Bank, as documented in the Secretary General's report, represent a significant impediment to peace and stability. The ongoing hostilities between Israel and Hamas in Gaza have resulted in a devastating humanitarian crisis. The loss of thousands of lives, extensive civilian displacements, and systematic destruction of critical infrastructure aggravate an already dire humanitarian situation faced by Palestinian communities. Such actions, including the expansion of settlements, acts of terror and violence against innocent people, destruction of private infrastructure, constitute a blatant violation of international law. These developments systematically undermine international efforts to de-escalate tensions and pursue a comprehensive resolution to the Middle East conflict. We therefore call on all parties to immediately cease these destructive actions and create meaningful opportunities for constructive dialogue and peaceful resolution of this protracted conflict. We further call on the parties to refrain from the rhetoric of incitement to violence, inflammatory provocations, hatred, speech, and other provocative actions that can only fuel the conflict. Madam President, in conclusion, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, the release of hostages, and the establishment of an impeded flow of humanitarian aid in line with Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the two-state solution, a vision predicted on the establishment of two independent sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, coexisting harmoniously, side by side, each enjoying full membership in the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank ASG Chiari and Dr. Efron for their briefings. And thank you, Mr. Levy, for sharing your brother's story with us. The suffering you and your family have been through is unimaginable. Let me state at the outset that the UK stands with you and with all those hostage families seeking desperately to bring their loved ones home. We reiterate our condemnation of the abhorrent Hamas attacks of 7 October 2023 and the kidnapping of over 250 hostages. That includes Emily Damari and 3 hostages with UK links. The hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Let me make 3 additional points. First, the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza is appalling. Over 45,000 Palestinians have died since 7 October. And the last 2 months were the worst for aid since October 2023. The UN has reported a shocking increase in cases of acute malnutrition in children, and that Gaza now has the highest number of child amputees per capita in the world. The UK continues to urge Israel to do much more to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure and to abide by their international obligations. This includes facilitating rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian aid and basic services to the Palestinian people. UNRWA plays a crucial role in delivering this life-saving aid. On the 11th of December, my Prime Minister committed an additional $16.5 million to UNRWA to support vital services for Palestinian refugees in the OPTs and the wider region, bringing the UK's support to UNRWA to $52 million since April this year. Second, President, northern Gaza must not be cut off from the south. The UK is clear. There must be no forcible transfer of Gazans from or within Gaza. There must be no reduction of the territory of the Gaza Strip. Israel's expansion of military infrastructure and the destruction of civilian buildings and agricultural land across the Strip is unacceptable. Third, the UK calls on Israel to stop settlement expansion on Palestinian land, which is illegal under international law, and to hold violent settlers to account. Continued instability and settler violence in the West Bank should not be tolerated by Israel, and the culture of impunity must end. This does nothing to bring about peace and security for Palestinians or Israelis. We also note the decision of the government of Israel to extend correspondent banking relations for 12 months and continue to urge Israel to remove its restrictions on clearance revenues. President, the fall of Assad and the ceasefire in Lebanon offer a moment of hope for the people of the region. We must now use this momentum to deliver a long sought-after ceasefire, secure the immediate release of all hostages, and put an end to the humanitarian crisis and suffering in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradezco al subsecretario general Chiari por su informe y reitero el apoyo de mi país a la labor de Naciones Unidas y todas sus agencias. Agradezco también a la señora Efron y al señor Levy por sus intervenciones. La primera sesión sobre este tema en la que el Ecuador participó como miembro elegido del Consejo de Seguridad se realizó el 5 de enero de 2023. Ese día, mi país afirmó que era necesario recordar la historia para abstenerse de repetir actos que en el pasado causaron ya violencia, destrucción y muerte en Israel y Palestina. Desde entonces, el Ecuador ha exhortado a las partes en repetidas ocasiones a que se abstengan de realizar actos de provocación e incitación, a evitar los actos de violencia y terrorismo, a detener la expansión de asentamientos en el territorio palestino ocupado, a controlar la violencia de los colonos y a respetar el status quo de los sitios sagrados de Jerusalén, a cumplir con las resoluciones de este Consejo. Aunque estos llamados no han sido escuchados, hoy los reiteramos, pues son tan vigentes como entonces, porque si estos llamados hubiesen sido atendidos, hoy la situación sería diferente. El domingo 8 de octubre de 2023, este Consejo mantuvo una sesión de consultas de emergencia. En esa ocasión, mi país expresó su más enérgica e inequívoca condena a los ataques terroristas perpetrados por Hamás el día anterior y exigió que los rehenes sean liberados inmediatamente y sin condición alguna. Desde entonces, lo hemos reiterado constantemente. No hay justificación posible para atacar a civiles inocentes y esos actos execrables son la causa inmediata de la guerra que asola Gaza hasta hoy. En esa misma ocasión, el Ecuador señaló que los ataques terroristas de Hamás no representan al pueblo palestino, ni a su derecho inalienable a la libre determinación, ni a sus aspiraciones legítimas de vivir con seguridad, libertad, justicia, oportunidades y dignidad. Se advirtió que la gravísima escalada del conflicto traería consigo muertes de civiles inocentes, entre ellos mujeres y niños, que la violencia traería más violencia y que se agravaría la ya precaria situación humanitaria que vivía la población civil, lo que hacía más incomprensible lo sucedido el 7 de octubre. Se subrayó que se deben respetar en todo momento los principios del derecho internacional humanitario, que es necesario evitar afectar a la población civil, que el derecho a la defensa no es una carta blanca para la venganza y que era necesario detener el círculo vicioso que ha provocado la situación actual. Ese 8 de octubre, señora presidenta, colegas, mi delegación dijo textualmente que el Ecuador apoyará desde este Consejo toda medida o iniciativa que impulse a las partes a detener la violencia y a retomar esas negociaciones. Hoy, en la última sesión prevista sobre este tema durante nuestra membresía actual, puedo decir que el Ecuador ha cumplido con su compromiso. Mi país ha influido y votado a favor de todas las iniciativas que han buscado esos objetivos, las vetadas por unos, las vetadas por otros y las 4 que fueron adoptadas y deben cumplirse. Hoy el Ecuador reitera su llamado a la implementación inmediata de esas 4 resoluciones adoptadas, 2712, 2720, 2728 y 2735. Es impostergable un inmediato alto al fuego, la liberación inmediata de todos los rehenes y la entrada y distribución de ayuda humanitaria suficiente y oportuna a Gaza. Señora Presidenta, lo he dicho ya muchas veces y lo vuelvo a hacer por última vez desde este puesto. La resolución de este conflicto no se dará por la fuerza. Casi 8 décadas de intentarlo sin éxito por ese camino deberían ser suficientes. La única salida es avanzar hacia una solución negociada, pacífica, definitiva y justa para las partes, con la existencia de 2 estados, Palestina e Israel, sobre la base de las fronteras de 1967 y de las resoluciones relevantes. Para ello se requiere voluntad política, valentía y visión a largo plazo por parte de quienes toman decisiones. Mi país hace votos para que un día no muy lejano, con buena fe, prevalezcan esas cualidades y ambos pueblos finalmente vivan en paz, con dignidad y seguridad, reconociendo en el otro a seres humanos con derechos y anhelos de igual valor que los suyos propios. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing and Dr. Efron and Mr. Levy for the perspectives they shared. Madam President, Guyana notes with concern that no steps were taken by Israel since the Secretary General's last report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 to comply with the provisions of that resolution. This ongoing stance of non-compliance is even more concerning, considering that the International Court of Justice has established that the Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are violations of international law. The court further established that Israel has an obligation to immediately cease all new settlement activities and to evacuate settlers from the occupied territories. Despite these clear legal provisions, however, Israel continues to violate international law through both its policies and practices regarding settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. In this context, the Secretary General's report sets out very clearly the violence and other human rights abuses that are the hallmark of Israeli settlement activity in the occupied Palestinian territory. Guyana therefore reiterates its call on Israel to strictly abide by its legal obligation as an occupying power to safeguard the rights and interests of the Palestinian people. Madam President, Guyana has taken note of the impact of Israel's settlement policies and practices on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We note, for example, the increasing number of fatal incidents and are alarmed that most Palestinians were killed by Israeli security forces in the context of Israeli operations. We have also taken note of the continuing incidents of displacement of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, attributed to demolitions and other illegal activities by Israelis. It is unjust that Palestinians are forced to live with the constant threat of violence and even death by the Israeli security forces and Israeli settlers, even when they are engaged in routine activities such as picking olives from their olive groves. Guyana deplores these acts in the strongest terms and underlines Israel's legal and moral obligation to desist. Madam President, the Secretary General's account of the situation in Gaza remains a point of deep concern for Guyana, as it does for the international community. According to Gaza's health ministry, the death toll has surpassed 45,000. This is shocking in any context and would elicit urgent and strong measures from this Council were we to act solely based on our Charter mandate. It is deeply lamentable that the Council has been unable to achieve consensus to act for the Palestinian people, while hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians are killed, disabled, displaced, orphaned, widowed, starved, among other violations, the depth and scale of which no report can perhaps adequately capture. What would it take to stop the seemingly unending suffering and killing of civilians? The answer is clear: strong political will that translates into action to end the impunity with which the rights of the Palestinian people have been violated for all these decades. Madam President, we urgently need a political horizon to move us beyond the status quo. We already have the relevant frameworks established by the resolutions adopted both by the General Assembly and this Council. The international community must work unceasingly to unclench the fist that holds Palestinian self-determination, which have persisted since the birth of the United Nations. This continues to be manifested in cycles of violence meted out against the Palestinian people with impunity, in the denial of their requests for full membership of the United Nations, for recognition, and to chart their own political path, among others. In all of this, the two-state solution continues to be effectively undermined. We cannot allow this to continue. This Council and the entire United Nations membership must continue to spare no efforts towards a two-state solution. Madam President, I conclude by highlighting 4 points. First, we need an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We have seen media reports about a potential deal between Israel and Hamas, and we urge the parties to prioritize the lives of civilians and to cease the hostilities. We also reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Second, Israel cannot continue to turn a blind eye to its international obligations concerning the Palestinian people. The illegal settlement activities must end, and Israel must repatriate all settlers from the occupied Palestinian territories. Additionally, member states must uphold their obligation to distinguish in their dealings with the State of Israel proper and Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. Third, the Council must unite as one and uphold its Charter mandate. We must achieve consensus to end the impunity with which Israel has continued to violate all of the UN resolutions on the question of Palestine. Finally, we must deliver peace for the Palestinian people. This entails support for establishing strong governance by Palestinians for Palestinians, even as we take decisive measures to bring the Israeli occupation to an end. Peace must also entail a resolution of all final status issues, including the refugee question. On this latter note, Guyana reiterates its strong support for UNRWA's mandate, noting that unless the refugees are able to exercise their right of return, that mandate cannot be unilaterally brought to an end by Israel or any other party. Guyana commits to continue its strong engagement on the question of Palestine, with a view to contributing to a just and lasting solution for peace in Palestine and Israel and in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je voudrais tout d'abord remercier le sous-secrétaire général Khaled Kiari pour sa présentation, ainsi que Madame Efron et Monsieur Levy pour leur témoignage. Il importe que le Conseil de sécurité reste actif face à l'accélération de la colonisation israélienne en Cisjordanie et à Jérusalem-Est, afin que soient mises en œuvre ses propres résolutions à ce sujet, y compris la résolution 2334. La position de la France est connue et constante. La colonisation est contraire au droit international et nous la condamnons. La Cour internationale de justice a indiqué dans son avis consultatif du 19 juillet 2024 qu'Israël avait l'obligation de mettre fin à sa présence dans les territoires palestiniens occupés dans les plus brefs délais. La France ne reconnaîtra jamais l'annexion illégale de territoires ni la légalisation de colonies sauvages. Elle met en œuvre la politique de différenciation prévue par la résolution 2334 de ce Conseil, qui vise à matérialiser la distinction juridique entre le territoire d'Israël internationalement reconnu et les territoires occupés. La politique de colonisation est un obstacle majeur à une paix juste et durable fondée sur la solution des deux États. Elle constitue également un facteur de tension et de violence sur le terrain. À cet égard, la politique de terreur conduite par certains colons israéliens contre la population palestinienne dans les territoires occupés doit cesser. En tant que puissance occupante, Israël a la responsabilité de prendre sans délai les mesures nécessaires pour protéger les civils palestiniens. À Jérusalem-Est, le statu quo historique sur les lieux saints doit être préservé. Dans la bande de Gaza, il faut que la guerre cesse. Il faut que les souffrances des civils cessent. La France demande un cessez-le-feu immédiat et permanent. Madame la Présidente, notre position est également sans ambiguïté sur un autre sujet important. Tous les otages doivent être libérés sans délai et sans condition. La France soutient les efforts de l'Égypte, des États-Unis et du Qatar pour y parvenir. Elle condamne une fois de plus les attaques terroristes barbares perpétrées par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023. Ce Conseil doit être en mesure de le faire sans ambiguïté. La situation humanitaire à Gaza est catastrophique. Il est impératif de garantir un accès humanitaire complet et sans entrave à la bande de Gaza et dans la bande de Gaza. Les populations doivent être secourues. Lors de la conférence humanitaire qui s'est tenue au Caire, le 2 décembre dernier, le ministre de l'Europe et des Affaires étrangères a annoncé une nouvelle aide humanitaire de 50 millions d'euros, dont 20 millions d'euros pour l'UNRWA. Madame la Présidente, ce Conseil a la responsabilité de poser les bases d'un règlement politique. Nous le savons, il passe par la mise en œuvre de la solution des deux États. La France réaffirme son attachement indéfectible à la sécurité d'Israël et à l'édification d'un État viable, souverain et contigu pour les Palestiniens. Elle appelle de ses vœux la mise en place d'une autorité palestinienne réformée, capable d'exercer ses responsabilités sur l'ensemble des territoires palestiniens, y compris dans la bande de Gaza. Seule la solution à deux États permettra de répondre aux aspirations légitimes des Israéliens et des Palestiniens à la paix et à la sécurité. C'est dans cet esprit que la France co-présidera en juin prochain, aux côtés de l'Arabie saoudite, une conférence internationale sur la mise en œuvre de la solution des deux États. Ce Conseil doit agir pour répondre à l'urgence de la situation et pour construire enfin cette solution politique. L'ONU devra jouer un rôle central dans cette perspective. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to start by thanking A.S. Chiari for his briefing and Ms. Efron and Mr. Levy for their testimonies. As always, today's meeting is a sobering reminder that peace in the Middle East, without an investment of astounding efforts, will stay elusive. The region is shaking. The trembles are affecting lives of individuals on a daily basis and without an end in sight. Madam President, in Gaza, strikes, including on densely populated areas, displacement and widespread destruction carry on in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. They are coupled with extreme hunger, disease, severe limitations to humanitarian assistance, and attacks on and looting of humanitarian convoys and humanitarian actors. International humanitarian law is clear regarding the rapid and unhindered delivery of aid. Suffering of civilians is intensifying, including of hostages still held in Gaza. All of this are further exacerbated by complete absence of law and order. We repeat that only a ceasefire will pave the way to peace. In the occupied West Bank, the advancement of new housing units is appalling, and we underline our long-standing position on the illegality of settlements. They are a violation of international law. We underline, once again, and in line with the ICJ advisory opinion, the occupation must end. The downward spiral in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has to end. This includes demolitions and seizures of property. We deplore the intensification of settler-related violence, as well as killings and injuries, including during operations, demonstrations, clashes, airstrikes, and other incidents. We share the concern about the large number of Palestinians, including children, detained by Israeli forces and in administrative detention. Numerous reports of torture and other ill treatment, including sexual violence, are profoundly distressing. Access of independent monitoring bodies to detention facilities must be ensured. We are also deeply concerned over the deep economic crisis affecting the Palestinian economy, prolonging and deepening the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. We support efforts to address Palestinian government's fiscal challenges, strengthening its governance capacity, and preparing it to resume its responsibilities in Gaza. Madam President, Slovenia continues supporting the efforts and the role of the United Nations. We praise the work of the UN workers on the ground, including of UNRWA, to address the suffering of civilians. We repeat our call to the Israeli government not to implement laws concerning UNRWA. The agency contributes to the broader efforts towards achieving a two-state solution, which is the only just and sustainable solution for peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis. We admire the dedication of UN representatives, and in this regard, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Special Coordinator Venesland for his work. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je voudrais aussi remercier le secrétaire général adjoint Khaled Chiari de sa présentation. Nous avons écouté attentivement la présentation de Madame Efron et le récit poignant de Monsieur Levy. La Suisse a fermement condamné, dès le 7 octobre, les actes de terreur et la prise d'otages par le Hamas et d'autres groupes affiliés en Israël. Madame la Présidente, permettez-moi de soulever un des thèmes qui aura le plus profondément préoccupé la Suisse tout au long de son mandat au Conseil de sécurité, la protection des civils, et notamment du personnel humanitaire. La Suisse est consternée par les faits rapportés à ce propos, parmi d'autres, dans le dernier rapport du secrétaire général portant sur la mise en œuvre de la résolution 2334. Selon le rapport, les frappes aériennes israéliennes auraient tué plusieurs acteurs et actrices humanitaires le 30 novembre dernier, dont un employé de Save the Children et 3 employés de World Central Kitchen. Ces victimes se sont ainsi ajoutées à la liste des plus de 330 humanitaires tués, dont une grande majorité d'employés de l'UNRWA. Depuis le 7 octobre 2023, Des dizaines de milliers de civils ont ainsi été tués, y compris encore ces dernières semaines. La Suisse condamne toute attaque contre les civils avec la plus grande fermeté. Le respect des principes de distinction, de proportionnalité et de précaution dans la conduite des hostilités sont des obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Par la résolution 2730 que la Suisse a rédigée et dont 115 États membres ont récemment soutenu les propositions de mise en œuvre avancées par le secrétaire général, le Conseil de sécurité a réaffirmé l'obligation de protéger le personnel et les biens employés dans les opérations humanitaires. Cette protection est d'autant plus cruciale à la lumière de la situation humanitaire catastrophique à Gaza. La population civile est notamment exposée au risque de famine, dont l'utilisation comme méthode de guerre constitue un crime de guerre en vertu du statut de Rome de la Cour pénale internationale. La Suisse continuera de s'engager pour un cessez-le-feu immédiat, inconditionnel et permanent, ainsi que la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des otages. Nous saluons à ce propos les efforts de médiation qui sont en cours. Nous rappelons l'obligation de respecter strictement le droit international humanitaire, y compris l'acheminement rapide, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire à toutes les personnes dans le besoin à Gaza. Ces mêmes demandes ont rallié une majorité écrasante d'États membres à l'Assemblée générale lors de la dernière séance de la session extraordinaire d'urgence le 11 décembre. Cela témoigne d'une volonté commune de mettre fin à cette guerre et à son bilan humain effroyable. Cela rappelle aussi le rôle central que joue actuellement l'UNRWA, dont le mandat est conféré par l'Assemblée générale depuis 1949 en tant que principal acteur humanitaire dans la bande de Gaza, pourvoyeur de services de base quasi étatiques dans l'ensemble du territoire palestinien occupé et comme rempart important contre une déstabilisation encore plus grande de la région. Madame la Présidente, la Suisse soutient l'avis consultatif de la Cour internationale de justice du 19 juillet dernier auquel elle a contribué. L'illégalité de l'occupation israélienne du territoire palestinien en cours depuis 1967 ne fait aucun doute. Cette occupation doit cesser dans les plus brefs délais. Nous regrettons profondément l'absence de mise en œuvre de la résolution 2334 comme des 4 résolutions adoptées par ce Conseil depuis les actes de terreur du 7 octobre. Partout dans le monde, le non-respect des décisions du Conseil est synonyme d'obstacle à la paix, de souffrance pour les populations et de processus de paix en faillite. J'en veux pour preuve la situation en Cisjordanie, y compris à Jérusalem-Est, où la violence n'a jamais été aussi élevée en raison des attaques de colons et des opérations menées par les forces de sécurité israéliennes. La Suisse est aussi préoccupée par les violences liées à la présence de groupuscules armés, notamment à Jénine. Elle réitère son appel à toutes les parties de respecter leurs obligations en vertu du droit international. Les opérations menées en Cisjordanie doivent répondre aux critères de nécessité et de proportionnalité et respecter le droit de tout individu à la vie et à la sécurité de sa personne. Tous les auteurs de violences envers les civils et de destruction délibérée de biens et d'infrastructures civiles doivent être traduits en justice. La Suisse condamne les annonces de dirigeants israéliens, comme relaté dans le rapport du secrétaire général, visant à l'expansion des colonies illégales en vertu du droit international dans le territoire palestinien occupé. Ces annonces sont de nature à alimenter davantage la spirale de violence et sont de clairs obstacles à la paix. Madame la Présidente, permettez-moi de conclure en affirmant une nouvelle fois le soutien plein et entier de la Suisse à la solution à 2 États, qui est la seule option possible pour Israéliens et Palestiniens de vivre côte à côte en paix, en sécurité et dans la dignité, à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues, conformément au droit international et aux paramètres convenus au niveau international. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, благодарим помощника генерального секретаря Халида Кьяри за обстоятельный доклад о ситуации на оккупированной палестинской территории, включая сектор Газа и западный берег реки Иордан. Внимательно выслушали Ширу Ефрон и Майкла Леви. Выражаем искреннее сочувствие Майклу Леви, его семье и всем семьям, находящихся в руках Хамас и других палестинских группировок заложников. надеемся на их скорейшее освобождение. К нашему огромному сожалению, все усилия Совета Безопасности ООН по установлению режима прекращения огня и освобождению заложников до сих пор блокируются Соединенными Штатами, которые с 7 октября прошлого года 6 раз применили право вето с тем, чтобы в Газе могла продолжаться израильская военная операция, и, соответственно, жизни заложников продолжали подвергаться опасности. Насколько мы понимаем, в результате только треть из изначально захваченных израильтян сегодня фигурирует в обсуждаемых переговорщиками списках. Желаем вам в конечном счете воссоединиться с вашим братом. А что касается молчания Совета и якобы нежелания осудить акцию Хамас, то Совет Безопасности был готов сделать это еще 18 октября 2023 года. Но наши американские коллеги заветировали соответствующий проект резолюции, о чем они сегодня очень не любят вспоминать. Уважаемые коллеги, как четко следует из выступления Халеда Хьяри, резолюция Совета Безопасности 2334 не выполняется. Израильтяне продолжают продвигать планы по строительству новых поселений на западном берегу реки Иордан, включая Восточный Иерусалим. Под надуманным предлогом отсутствия разрешения на строительство планомерно уничтожаются палестинские жилища. Предельно циничная ситуация, когда палестинцы, которые не могут позволить себе заплатить дорогие пошлины израильтянам, вынуждены собственными руками сносить жилье. Это выглядит насмешкой над человеческим достоинством. Непрекращающееся незаконное строительство и расширение израильских поселений на Сбри, включая Восточный Иерусалим, ведет к подрыву переговорного решения одной из проблем окончательного статуса – территории и границы. Оно ведется в нарушении известных решений Совета Безопасности и Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН, включая принятую в сентябре резолюцию 10-й чрезвычайной спецсессии Генеральной Ассамблеи в поддержку второго консультативного заключения Международного суда ООН о правовых последствиях политики Израиля на оккупированной палестинской территории. На этом фоне особую тревогу вызывают высказывания израильских официальных лиц о насильственном изменении демографического состава Газа в целях реколонизации анклава. Глубоко возмущены принятием Кнессетом закона о депортации семей террористов, который дает МВД Израиля право отправлять в Газу тех палестинцев, кто не сообщил израильским силам безопасности о преступных замыслах своих родственников. Таким образом, любой неблагонадежный, по мнению израильтян, палестинец может попасть в анклав, где ему будет уготована участь умереть либо от голода, либо от бомбардировок. И такие законы принимаются в стране, которая утверждает, что является единственной демократией на Ближнем Востоке. Считаем подобные шаги неприемлемыми, равно как и публичные призывы некоторых членов правительства кабинета Нетаньяху к аннексии Сбри. Категорически отвергаем политику создания фактов на земле. Израильская оккупация палестинской территории в любом случае незаконна с точки зрения международного права, и никаких оправданий для нее быть не может. Призываем Западный Иерусалим незамедлительно приступить к выполнению резолюции 2334 и прекратить любую поселенческую активность. Госпожа председатель, сегодня многие говорили о продолжающемся насилии на ОПТ и приводили ужасающую статистику. С начала обострения конфликта в Газе убито уже 45 тысяч палестинцев. Это только тех, о которых достоверно известно. В большинстве своем женщины и дети. На фоне этих чудовищных цифр несколько в тени остается статистика по Сбри. А ведь там с октября 2023 года по 31 октября 2024 года убито 736 палестинцев. И это в условиях формального отсутствия военной операции. Жизнь палестинских граждан на Сбри уже практически невыносима. В докладе генерального секретаря приводится яркая иллюстрация бессмысленности и беспощадности насилия со стороны израильских поселенцев. 5 октября группа из 40 израильтян, вооруженных ружьями, дубинками, ломами и перцовыми баллончиками, отправилась на охоту за сборщиками оливок. Нападавшие избили 25 палестинцев, сломали им конечности, разбили головы. Среди жертв был ребенок, инвалид, женщина, пожилой человек. После этого поселенцы выбросили весь урожай и украли инвентарь. Что же сделали прибывшие на место израильские полицейские, которые вроде бы призваны поддержать порядок в правовом, как утверждают израильские власти государства? Они разогнали палестинцев шумовыми гранатами. Такое отношение к палестинцам, как к людям второго сорта, абсолютно недопустимо, и международное сообщество обязано добиваться прекращения этой чудовищной политики Западного Иерусалима. Ситуацию на Сбре невозможно рассматривать в отрыве от более широкого контекста эскалации в Газе. Прекратить ее не удается уже более года. Члены Совета Безопасности неоднократно выдвигали проекты резолюции с требованием безусловного прекращения огня в Газе как первого шага для стабилизации обстановки на ОПТ. К сожалению, Соединенные Штаты, как мы уже сказали, последовательно ветировали эти документы, ссылаясь на то, что никто не должен навязывать Израилю мирное решение. Мы не спорим с тем, что Израиль суверенное государство, и не подвергаем сомнению его право на обеспечение собственной безопасности. Однако нас тревожит, что израильская сторона обосновывает этим правом не только борьбу с терроризмом на своей территории, но и коллективное наказание палестинского народа в Газе и на Сбри, бомбежки Ливана, Сирии, оккупацию сирийских земель. Складывается впечатление, что полноценное обеспечение собственной безопасности Израиль видит как создание вокруг себя безлюдной пустыни, на которую будут нацелены израильские танки, беспилотники и истребители. А договариваться с палестинцами, ливанцами и сирийцами Западный Иерусалим планирует исключительно с позиции силы и устрашения, рассчитывая на то, что Вашингтон всегда прикроет и окажет ему необходимую дипломатическую и военную поддержку. Но таким способом конфликты не решаются, а только усугубляются. Если довести людей до состояния, когда им нечего терять, то не стоит удивляться, почему радикальные идеи становятся столь популярными среди населения. Не следует удивляться и фактическому замораживанию процесса нормализации отношений регионалов с Израилем на фоне кровавой операции в Газе. Вместо того, чтобы искать решение имеющихся проблем, Западный Иерусалим создает новые. Вступление в силу в начале следующего года принятых Кнессетом законопроектов о запрете деятельности БАПОР будет означать прекращение демонтажа работы ключевой, безальтернативной структуры ООН по оказанию помощи палестинцам. Этот шаг является не только прямым нарушением Устава ООН, резолюции Генеральной Ассамблеи, определяющих мандат агентства, и норм международного права, но и прологом к снятию проблемы беженцев в качестве одного из вопросов окончательного статуса наряду с границами, водными ресурсами и Иерусалимом. Израильские действия в Газе за прошедшие месяцы не дают надежды на то, что Израиль, как оккупирующая держава, возьмет на себя все функции БАПОР. Госпожа председатель, мы верим, что существует альтернатива тому, что происходит на ОПТ. Эта альтернатива выражается в воле международного сообщества, продемонстрированной принятием подавляющим большинством голосов резолюций 10-й чрезвычайной специальной сессии Генассамблеи в поддержку мандата БАПОР, а также с требованием прекращения огня в Газе. Российская принципиальная позиция по ближневосточному регулированию совпадает с волей международного сообщества. Мы выступаем за безусловное прекращение огня, беспрепятственный гуманитарный доступ, освобождение всех заложников и насильственно удерживаемых лиц, перезапуск мирного процесса на общепризнанной международно-правовой основе. Только так возможно не только добиться устойчивого мира между палестинцами и израильтянами, но и устранить источник дестабилизации всего региона. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Hari and Dr. Efron for their informative briefings. I'm also deeply grateful to Mr. Levy for his brave testimony. I express our great sorrow for the harrowing experiences you and your family have endured. Let me reiterate Japan's strong condemnation of the brutal acts of terror by Hamas and others, and demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Madam President, the Middle East is at a crucial turning point. While the situation in the region remains fragile, recent events have offered a ray of hope for peace. In Lebanon, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a ceasefire. Japan welcomes this achievement and commends the mediation efforts by the United States and France. All parties should take all measures to fully implement this ceasefire agreement and bring about stability. In Syria, the Assad regime has fallen. We need to follow the situation with caution, as it might be the start of a spiral of social unrest. Nevertheless, Japan strongly hopes This historic event will lead to fundamental and positive developments inside and outside of the country. The future of Syria, a future that has significant ramifications for the entire region, must be determined by the Syrian people themselves. Japan is committed to fully supporting an inclusive and peaceful Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition process, leading to a lasting peace and stability. Madam President, we hope these evolving circumstances will help realize a breakthrough in devastating conflict in Gaza, where many hostages continue to be held and IDF's military operations remain active. The enormous number of casualties of innocent Palestinians and severe damage to civilian infrastructure in Gaza are totally unacceptable. The persistent humanitarian catastrophe is also intolerable. Israel's response to the situation appears inconsistent with its obligation under international humanitarian law. A ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages are long overdue. The dramatic expansion of humanitarian aid delivery is urgently needed, and for this purpose we need to continue the presence of UNRWA. At the same time, the agency should take steps to assure its neutrality. That is why Japan voted in favor of the two relevant General Assembly resolutions last week, which gained support from more than 150 countries. We urge all parties, including Israel, to listen to the voices of the international community. A negotiated settlement between the parties is also key to making a real difference on the ground. In this regard, Japan is encouraged by the reports of a resumption of the ceasefire talks and the seemingly forward-looking progress. We support the tireless efforts of the mediators. Both parties should seize the opportunity to finalize concluding the deal. But the ceasefire, even if it is materialized, does not mark the end of the tragedy. Tremendous challenges lie ahead to rebuild Gaza and provide for the well-being of the people living there. As a country that has experienced destruction and restoration after the Second World War and many huge natural disasters, Japan stands ready to meaningfully contribute to the early recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. Ultimately, the only viable way out of this conflict is the peaceful coexistence of Israel and Palestine. Japan remains steadfastly committed to this vision. We oppose Israel's illegal settlement activities and any attempts to annex the West Bank. These would undermine the viability of a two-state solution and must stop immediately. We will also spare no effort to revitalize the Palestinian Authority financially and politically, both here at the UN and through our own initiatives, equally after our current term in this Council is over. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, we thank Mr. Khaled Khiari for his comprehensive briefing. And we take note of the interventions of the civil society representatives. We extend our gratitude to the Secretary General for his sobering report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. It is a report filled with anguish and despair for the Palestinian people, a stark testament to the ongoing impunity with which the Israeli occupying power disregards international law. It also reflects the paralysis of the international community in the face of such blatant and systematic violation. This report is yet another painful reminder of our collective failure collective failure to uphold the right and dignity of the Palestinian people. Madam President, in Gaza, people are not living. They are simply waiting to die. People are not living. They are simply waiting to die. As the Secretary General himself recalled, the catastrophe in Gaza is nothing short of a complete breakdown of our common humanity. End of quote. The death toll now exceeds 45,000. 45,000. 70% of whom are women and children, with more than 107,000 wounded. The entire neighborhood in Gaza have been demolished. Today, violence, disease, and starvation are omnipresent threat. Humanitarian aid remain highly insufficient to meet the immense needs of the population. Quite simply, Gaza has turned into a graveyard for the living. As if these miserable conditions were not enough, the Israeli occupying army systematically hunts Palestinian civilians from one shelter to another. On December 15, just 3 days ago, 4 schools sheltering displaced families were bombed, killing at least 50 people. For those who doubted the gravity of the violation of the international humanitarian law under Israeli occupations, the facts presented in the Secretary General reports leave no room for ambiguity, leave no room for question. Objective observers will reach the conclusion that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. This is meticulously documented by Amnesty International in their recent report, pertinently titled, "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman: Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza." So what will the international community do in the face of this genocide? Will it continue to perpetuate impunity? Will it continue to perpetuate immunity? Will it continue to obstruct international justice? Will it continue to deprive Palestinians of their fundamental rights? Is it not time for justice? Is it not time for accountability? Stopping the ethnic cleansing is for us a moral and legal duty. Madam President, a ceasefire in Gaza is long overdue. We deeply regret these councils' inability to demand an immediate, unconditional, and a permanent ceasefire. The Security Council would have acted decisively to fulfill its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. We cannot continue to look away. Madam President, the situation in the West Bank, including Al-Quds Sharif, is equally alarming. The Security Council, the General Assembly, and the International Court of Justice have reaffirmed that Israeli settlements and associated practices constitute flagrant violations of international law. Yet, settlement activity continues unabated. In 2024 alone, plans for over 13,000 housing units have been advanced. Meanwhile, Palestinians' houses are destroyed. Meanwhile, Palestinians live in terror of settler violence, emboldened by the protection of the occupying authorities. While we acknowledge the very light sanctions imposed by some countries against few settlers, this Council cannot remain silent. Furthermore, the daily killing of Palestinians, including women and children, underscores the relentless violence they endure. On average, one Palestinian child is killed every 2 days in the West Bank, a chilling reminder of the human toll of the Israeli occupation. Moreover, the Palestinian National Project now faces yet another threat: annexation. We strongly condemn statements by several Israeli officials calling for the annexation of the West Bank, a clear violation of international law. It jeopardizes any prospects for peace. It undermines efforts toward the establishment of the State of Palestine. This very Council must stand resolutely against this plan. Mr. President, we reiterate our strong condemnation of the decisions adopted by the Israeli authorities aimed at halting UNRWA's activities in the occupying Palestinian territories. If implemented, these measures will utterly deny Palestinians The situation is dire, not irreversible. This stability and security in the Middle East are closely linked to the resolution of the Palestinian issue, which requires the end of the occupation and the restoration of the Palestinian people's inalienable rights. The establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital is not merely a legitimate aspiration of the Palestinian people, but the cornerstone for achieving lasting peace in the whole Middle East. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我要感谢加利助理秘书长和民间社会通报人的通报。上周三，紧急特别联大以压倒性多数通过2份决议，要求立即在加沙无条件实现持久停火，消除人道准入障碍，保障联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处履职。令人遗憾的是，在决议通过后的1周里，又有上百名无辜的巴勒斯坦平民在加沙被以色列的炮火夺去生命。当前，加沙200多万民众仍在战火、饥饿、疾病和严寒中苦苦挣扎，期盼国际社会早日给他们带来和平的曙光。安理会为推动停火止暴、缓解灾难做出了巨大努力。但是，由于一个常任理事国的一再阻拦，安理会在巴以问题上的应对令国际社会深感失望。我们注意到，有关国家声称停火谈判即将达成，然而目前对加沙的袭击轰炸仍然没有停止，无辜的平民仍在持续丧生。中方支持安理会运用工具箱中的所有选项，采取一切必要行动，平息加沙战火，敦促有关国家不要再阻拦安理会采取行动。与此同时，中方敦促以色列听取国际社会的强烈呼声，立即停止在加沙的军事行动，履行国际人道法义务，解除对加沙的封锁和人道准入限制，停止打压工程处等人道机构，为加沙全境的人道行动提供安全保障。主席，正如许多国家代表在紧急特别联大发言中指出的那样，在巴勒斯坦问题上，仅靠零敲碎打的危机管控，无法避免历史再次陷入冲突动荡的恶性循环。只有实现巴勒斯坦问题的全面、公正、持久解决，才能迎来巴以真正的持久和平，才能开启中东和平稳定的新篇章。中方认为，必须坚守两国方案。两国方案是解决巴勒斯坦问题的唯一可行出路。国际社会应制止以色列在约旦河西岸非法定居点的野蛮扩张，拒绝任何吞并西岸的危险企图。加沙是巴勒斯坦不可分割的重要组成部分，加沙的未来安排应当以以色列的撤军为前提，由巴勒斯坦人民自主协商决定。必须结束非法占领。历史充分证明，长期的占领只会阻碍巴勒斯坦人民实现民族自决，让以色列拥有对巴勒斯坦建国的独家否决权。 只会滋生更多的仇恨和对立，给中东埋下动荡不安的祸根。以色列的占领违反安理会和联大决议，违反国际法。立即结束这种非法行为是以色列必须履行的国际义务。必须实现独立建国。犹太民族早已独立建国，而巴勒斯坦人民的建国权、生存权、回归权却长期遭到漠视。只有巴勒斯坦和以色列两个国家比邻而居，和平共处，才能真正实现持久和平。中方支持建立以1967年边界为基础，以东耶路撒冷为首都，享有完全主权的独立的巴勒斯坦国，支持巴勒斯坦国成为联合国的正式会员国。最后，中方愿同国际社会一道，继续为早日平息战火、恢复地区和平、实现巴勒斯坦问题的全面、公正、持久解决，做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United States. Thank you, Assistant Secretary General Chiari, for your briefing. I also wish to thank Dr. Efron for your briefing and also for your recommendations. And Michael Levy, I want to especially thank you for sharing your anguish, your frustration with this council. We will continue our efforts to do everything possible to bring your brother Or home to his loving family. Colleagues, the United States is committed to finalizing a ceasefire in Gaza with the release of hostages that allows for a surge in humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians. That is our North Star. And despite progress coming in fits and starts, despite progress feeling at times frustratingly slow, there is still a reason for hope. Thanks to the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, Hamas is isolated. As we sit here, negotiators are in the region, working hard to close the remaining gaps between the parties. Now, let me be clear, I'm not starry-eyed here, but there are still difficult issues to resolve. We cannot give up on diplomacy. We cannot give up on the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza for over a year have lived through hell, a hell that was ignited by Hamas when it attacked Israel on October 7th. This was not an effort at peace. This was a declaration of war. And as we heard from Michael, we cannot give up on the 100+ remaining hostages, including 7 Americans or their families, who have also endured the unimaginable these past 14 months. Colleagues, granting Hamas, a terrorist organization, their demand for an immediate unconditional ceasefire offers no path to durable peace. It will not end the suffering or cycles of violence for Israelis and Palestinians. Instead, we must speak with one voice and demand that Hamas agree to release the hostages they are holding so that we can implement the deal on the table, to end the suffering of hostages from more than a dozen member states and millions of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and to put the parties back on a path toward a 2-state solution. It also is time for Israel and the United Nations to stop working against each other and instead take pragmatic steps to ensure there is no interruption of humanitarian aid delivery to Palestinians in desperate need. We reiterate our concern that Israel must not in any way restrict the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, imposing obstacles that must be removed. Going forward, Israel must also ensure that the implementation of recent legislation does not further impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance and critical services, including by UNRWA, which remains a vital lifeline for Palestinians. Equally vital, as the aid delivery architecture in Gaza evolves, the UN must work with all relevant parties and have a viable plan in place to facilitate aid deliveries. The Secretary General's recent letter regarding UNRWA and the future of aid delivery in Gaza suggests that the UN has not yet begun an earnest conversation with Israel regarding implementation of the legislation. Nor does it appear that relevant UN agencies have had detailed conversations regarding steps they could take to help ensure continuity of UN aid deliveries to Gaza. With lives in the balance, this must change. The UN must demonstrate that it will continue to work to find a path to support the people of Gaza. Colleagues, cynicism will not end this horrific conflict, but bold leadership can offer the prospects of a durable peace, one in which Palestinians and Israelis live side by side with equal levels of dignity, security, and opportunity. To put a finer point on it, a durable peace between Israelis and Palestinians will only be achieved through a negotiated two-state solution consistent with this Council's resolutions. There's no other path that guarantees Palestinians can live with the freedom and dignity they deserve. And there's no other path that guarantees an enduring peace between Israel and its neighbors. This is a peace worth striving for, and it's one the United States has worked tirelessly to advance, even in the darkest hours since October 7th. And so even as we work to surge relief into Gaza right now, we must also think about a day after, one in which Gaza is reunited with the West Bank under the control and governance of a revitalized and reformed Palestinian Authority. Economic security in the West Bank offers a foundation on which the parties can build. In this regard, we welcome the Israeli government's recent decision to extend correspondent bank relationships between Israeli banks and their Palestinian counterparts for another year. It's a step in the right direction to help build trust and deepen economic links, but it's just a start. We need to see a resumption of the economic activities, including worker permits that ground to a halt following October 7th. We also remain deeply concerned that other Israeli actions in the West Bank undercut the Palestinian Authority's ability to meet the needs of the Palestinian people and more broadly dampen the prospects of a two-state solution. Colleagues, we reiterate our position that advancing Israeli settlements in the West Bank is an obstacle to the achievement of a two-state solution, the end state we all want to see as we seek to bring the fighting in Gaza to a close. Yet, more settlement units were approved this past year than in any other 12-month period this decade. We reiterate our belief that Israel's program of support for the expansion of settlements is inconsistent with international law and only serves to weaken Israeli security. We also remain deeply concerned about violence committed by extremist settlers in the West Bank. A disproportionate amount of this violence emanates from illegal outposts, several dozen of which have been established over the past year. To be clear, these outposts are illegal under Israeli law. The hundreds of violent attacks over the past year have forced Palestinians to abandon their homes and vacate more than a dozen of their villages. Even more alarming last year saw the highest number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank since the UN began collecting data in 2005. We condemn the attacks by extremist settlers in the strongest possible terms and reiterate that Israel must intervene and stop them, or better yet, prevent them in the first place. To that end, we urge Israel to halt efforts to legalize outposts in the West Bank and to do everything possible to de-escalate tensions and hold all perpetrators of violence accountable, no matter the background of the perpetrator or the victim. Colleagues, I first addressed this council on this topic in March of 2021 during my first presidency. I had just arrived at the United States mission to the United Nations just a few weeks prior. And I outlined 3 pillars of U.S. policy with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first was to sustain our ironclad commitment to Israel's security. The second was to help both Israelis and Palestinians take steps toward a two-state solution, ensuring Israel's future as a democratic and Jewish state while upholding the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations for a state of their own. And the third was to deliver aid to the Palestinian people. I said then, and I quote, "Let us strive to achieve peace and prosperity for all." So much has changed since that meeting nearly 4 years ago. So many lives have been shattered before, on, and in the months that have followed October 7th as a result of the catastrophic conflict that Hamas instigated. But now, like in 2021, the United States remains committed to bringing that cycle to an end. And so we will continue to work tirelessly to advance diplomacy on the ground. For a ceasefire with the release of hostages, for a surge of aid today and days after in Gaza that reaffirms the dignity, the security, and opportunity of Palestinians and Israelis alike. For a two-state solution and a new day for the next generation. Let us strive to achieve that peace and prosperity for all. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of Mozambique has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you. Madam President, I have asked the floor for the second time just to make a correction to the statement I just delivered. Our thanks go to Assistant Secretary General Khalid Chiari instead of Madame Di Carlo, as I mentioned by mistake. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their further statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the observer state of Palestine.
Madam President, let me at the outset thank the Council members who will be departing at the end of the year, namely Malta, Mozambique, Switzerland, Ecuador, and Japan, for their relentless efforts to uphold international law, including through achieving a ceasefire, the necessary prerequisite for everything else the Council has called to achieve. Allow me also to say that while we reject the U.S. resorting several times to the veto over the last year, I want to commend your personal engagement and your constructive approach, always seeking to move the needle in the right direction, in manners that the wider public is unaware of. Allow me also to thank the briefers to whom we listened carefully, and to thank the Secretary General and his representative, Khalid Khayari, ASG, for the report on implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 and for their diligent efforts. Madam President, another year is ending and the massacres have yet to end. The Council adopted a year ago, almost day for day, Resolution 2720. And still, a year later, starvation and famine are an integral part of the Israeli assault on our people. In Gaza, every Palestinian life has either been upended or completely ended. More than 150,000 casualties, Palestinian children, women, and men murdered, wounded, maimed by a ruthless Israeli military onslaught by air, land, and sea that continues as we speak, claiming more lives every single day. More than 17,000 Palestinian children have been orphaned or separated from their parents. Our children now represent the largest cohort of child amputees per capita in the whole world. Over 12,000 Palestinians are detained. Many of them have been abducted, subjected to torture, sexual abuse, and even killed. Thousands more civilians are unaccounted for. The torment of those who survive untold. Trauma and terror, destruction and devastations inflicted on the Palestinian people with no end in sight. A mass collective punishment unseen in our world in this century. Over a year ago, and from this same chamber, we called for a ceasefire that would allow Palestinian and Israeli families to be reunited in life, not death. We called for respect of civilian life, all civilian life. Let me repeat, we called for respect of civilian life, all civilian life, not preferring some over others. We warned of what would come if a ceasefire was not imposed. And yet, only a few weeks ago, another draft resolution put forward by the E10 and calling for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, which enjoyed the support of 14 Security Council members, was vetoed by the United States. The General Assembly, acting under Uniting for Peace and taking action where the Council failed to demand this immediate and unconditional and permanent ceasefire. And we call yet again on the Council, if such a ceasefire does not come about in the coming days, and we hope it does, we ask you to act under Chapter 7 to demand an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. That is the only way to bring to an end to the massacres, to secure the release of prisoners and hostages, to ensure humanitarian aid reaches all those in need, to end the forcible displacement of our people and annexation of our land, and to ensure the full withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces. Madam President, this Council adopted 8 years ago the landmark Resolution 2334, to put an end to the land grab and to pave the way to ending the Israeli occupation and achieving a just peace. But unfortunately and expectedly, Israel persisted in pursuing its colonial agenda, flagrantly and wantonly breaching international law and UN resolutions. And this Council and all states are yet to adopt the measures that hold Israel accountable for its crimes, bring them to a halt, and reverse its unlawful annexation of Palestinian land. Since the onset of the occupation, Israel has confined Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory to the areas already built up and inhabited. Only 13% of East Jerusalem and 40% of the rest of the West Bank. The aim has always been to ensure that Israel could seize maximum Palestinian land with minimum Palestinians. But even that was not enough, and Israel decided to violently displace and replace our people, to forcibly displace Palestinian families and communities, to demolish their homes, to build settlements in the heart of our cities, and in a manner to destroy the territorial integrity of our state and to fragment our people and our land. The ICJ has stated in no uncertain terms, and I quote, "The sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful." End of quotation. The court called for an end of Israelis' unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible and reminded all states and the UN of their obligations in this regard. Only resolute action and measures of accountability by the international community as a whole shall lead Israel to stop its methodical destruction of the Palestinian people, of the Palestinian state, of the two-state solution, and of the prospects of peace in our region. In this regard, we await the report of the Secretary General, we expect in a few days, on implementation of Resolution ES-10/24 and ES-10/26 to inform future action by the membership. We will study it thoroughly, we hope you do, and then we will decide on the next steps forward. We welcome the launch of the Global Alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution and the decision of the General Assembly to hold a high-level international conference in June 2025, and I think my French colleague referred to it, on the implementation of the relevant UN resolutions pertaining to the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the two-state solutions. We call on all states to act without delay in line with their obligations under the Charter and international law to bring an end to Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory and to ensure the realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination and independence. Madam President, Israel, in parallel to its full-fledged assault against the Palestinian people, is attacking all those trying to support Palestinian rights and to save Palestinian lives. We have seen it with the UN and especially UNRWA. And we welcome the overwhelming support by the General Assembly for the agency in the face of relentless Israeli attacks. And we have seen it against international NGOs, most recently Amnesty International, following their report concluding that Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. And we have seen it against states, most recently against Ireland. The Israeli foreign minister closed the Israeli embassy in Dublin, stating, and I quote, that Ireland has crossed every red line. Really? So Israel continues genocide, starves and forcibly displaces a people, colonizes and annexes land. But it is Ireland which has crossed every red line for denouncing these crimes, for insisting on respect for international law and for human rights. You must be kidding me. How much more absurd can this situation get? How much more indecent can Israeli officials get? Israel has now accused the UN, almost every state on earth, the ICJ, the ICC, the world's most renowned NGOs, public figures, and moral voices of our time of anti-Semitism. Jews around the world cannot be held responsible for Israelis' actions, nor can Israel speak in their name or use them as shield to deflect condemnation of its violations. We reject this deliberate conflation between the actions of a state, or should I say the crimes of a state, and those who belong to a given faith. And we should all consider that this is dangerous and a terrible disservice to the fight against anti-Semitism and must demand it stop. Ireland and other countries around the world have shown that they will not be deterred nor distracted by Israelis' baseless attacks and smear campaigns. They will hold to their principled positions despite the bullying, threats, and harassment. We salute all those who are standing up for freedom, justice, and peace, many informed by their own histories and their own struggles, and are pushed to action by their commitment to international law and to human rights. Madam President, those who think they can end this conflict by taking more Palestinian lives and unlawfully colonizing more Palestinian land, or that they can bypass or ignore the Palestinian question and somehow establish peace in our region, are delusional. They are ignoring 77 years of history that demonstrates that there is no way around the Palestinian issue, and that there will be no peace in our region without the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. Let me repeat, that there will be no peace in our region without the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. We are out of time, but are not out of options. We are not powerless. Occupation, war, and death are not our only horizon. But we all need to take the required actions to bring them to an end. No more delays, no more excuses, no more half measures. No more strong speeches and weak actions. Let me repeat that. No more strong speeches and weak actions. Action speaks louder than words. This is a time to show resolve, to be guided by moral clarity, and to lead by example. We call on each state to examine what more they can and must do to uphold international law and to implement UN resolutions. And we tell them they have a responsibility before history and humanity, for our people, for all peoples, to act now so that freedom, justice, and peace can prevail. Act now to end the massacre and genocide in Gaza, to end the ethnic cleansing and apartheid, to end this illegal occupation, to end the conflict, and to achieve peace. We ask for nothing more than the rights international law guaranteed to our people. But we also cannot accept anything less. The Palestinian people need your continued support and solidarity, now more than ever. Please do not forsake them. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari and Dr. Efron for their briefings. I would like to thank the United States for allowing the voices of the hostage families to finally be heard in this council. Michael, thank you for your brave and incredibly powerful briefing. We will do everything we can to bring your brother and all of the hostages home. I must note my disgust at the fact that the Algerian representative could not bring himself to acknowledge Michael and the pain he suffers every day because of Hamas, or even mention the crimes of Hamas in Gaza. As we have reached the end of a very long year, I would like to ask you all to cast your minds back to these past 12 months. The pain and suffering felt by so many, including the families of the 100 hostages still held by Hamas, and the sacrifices made to protect the innocent from terrorists. However, this was also 12 months of immense transformation, and ahead of us lies opportunity. In 2024, the Middle East has become virtually unrecognizable. We continue to dismantle Hamas, and we continue to eliminate any threat that they may pose, and rid Gaza of their terrorist oppressors. Moving north, Hezbollah, once Iran's most vicious and dangerous proxy, has been heavily degraded. Arch terrorists, you remember those names: Yahya Sinwar, Muhammad Def, Hassan Nasrallah, Ibrahim Akil, and dozens of others who have caused unimaginable suffering to millions, not only Israelis, have been eliminated. Now, the Assad regime, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of his own people, has crumbled to dust. It is obvious to all that these are not isolated events. They are all connected, and together they present an extraordinary opportunity for this Council and the world. The chance before us is clear, the chance to finally end the Islamic regime of Iran's aspirations for a Shiite supremacist empire, the chance to liberate the world from the most corrupt, most violent, most destabilizing regime. Israel has acted decisively. We have struck the terror networks that once cast a shadow over our region. But the burden of securing peace does not rest on Israel's shoulders alone. Iran's provocations continue to escalate, with shameless threats about its nuclear ambitions. Its proxies in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, remain active and deadly, spreading chaos far beyond the region. This is not a localized threat. The Islamic regime of Iran is a danger to the entire world. The recent report from the International Atomic Energy Agency on Iran's nuclear progression, alongside the recent letter from the UK, France, and Germany, highlighting Iran's, and I quote, significant non-compliance, were cries for immediate action. This is not about hypothetical future. The danger is already here, looming on the horizon. The time to act is now. This Council must implement crushing sanctions to suffocate Iran's ability to fund its proxies. You must designate the IRGC, its tentacle of terror, as a terrorist organization. These steps are not optional. They are imperative. The Islamic regime thrives on inaction and indecision. If you fail, if you be silent to act decisively, you are complicit in enabling their campaign of terror. Let me be unequivocal. Israel has no intention of occupying Syria or parts of Syria. We are not empire builders, we are defenders. Defenders of our people, our borders, and our right to live in peace. Our actions are limited and defensive. Madam President, we are now approaching the holiday of Hanukkah. It is a time of reflection and resilience, a time to draw lessons from history. Hanukkah tells the story of two miracles. The first, of the oil lasting for 8 days in the temple. It was a divine act beyond human control. But the second miracle, the triumph of the Maccabees over the mighty Greek Empire, was a statement to human courage, to the will of a small but determined people who refused to bow to tyranny. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw a cruel and evil regime also overthrown by the determined population which it had oppressed for decades. We all know what Assad did to his people. And now I want to approach and tell to the brave and the ancient Iranian people. I say to you directly, to the people of Iran, do not miss this rare historic opportunity. Take action now. The people of Israel stand by your side. And I will approach you in your language. Marduma Iran in forsata nadare tarihira as das nadahid. Akdam kunid. Marduma Israel darkanara shuma hastand. I am telling to the Iranian people, we know the cost of freedom and the courage it demands. Your fight is not just for yourselves, but for the millions of lives the regime has destabilized and destroyed. In your hands lies the power to restore the beautiful Iranian nation, to rebuild a land rich in history, culture, and resilience. Madam President, as we reflect on the hope of Hanukkah, we must also confront the unfinished work before us. The scars of terrorism remain fresh. There are still 100 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, enduring conditions that are beyond comprehension. As we speak, Israel is negotiating for their freedom. Hamas's crimes against humanity are despicable, and yet much of the world remains silent. Colleagues, while we dismantle Hamas's terror network, we continue our humanitarian efforts to ensure aid reaches those in need. Hundreds of trucks enter Gaza on a daily basis. The total aid amount has now reached 1.2 million tons. Just this past Saturday, we coordinated the entry of 5,000 liters of fuel to operate essential hospital systems. Alongside the fuel, we delivered hundreds of boxes of medical equipment and food. Additionally, 36 patients and caregivers were transferred to more stable hospitals in Gaza. Yet, look what happened on the same day. As we delivered life-saving medical aid to Gazan civilians, Hamas terrorists fired rockets just 50 meters from an international aid warehouse. That's the reality we are facing. We will continue to do our work. We will continue to open new aid crossings. We will continue to facilitate aid with our international partners. As we conclude this painful yet transformative year, Israel looks to the future. Each of us are intelligent enough to recognize that there are two sides at this table, and let's be honest about it. One side truly desires a constructive, meaningful, and peaceful future. The other side, however, uses this conflict as a tool to promote their own agendas. Some use it to distract from their conflicts in their own corner of the world. Some use it to sustain their failing organizations, and others use it to serve their domestic political interests. Ultimately, Israel will remain clear-eyed. We will bring back all of our hostages. We will continue to do what is necessary to see that peaceful, constructive future realized, regardless of the noise, the bias, and the agendas we see play out in this room and beyond. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.